The sound was absolutely deafening. The reverberation off the damp, rotting wood of the floorboards above us made it feel like the entire abandoned Ohio farmhouse was about to collapse on our heads. My heavy boots slipped against the slick, moss-covered stone as I sprinted down the final few steps into the pitch-black basement. My flashlight beam cut wildly through the thick, suffocating darkness, illuminating a chaotic, swirling cloud of century-old dust. And in the center of that erratic beam was Max. "Max! Max, back away!" "Leave it!" I shouted, my voice cracking, echoing harshly against the confined walls. But my 80-pound German Shepherd completely ignored my commands. This was T-normal. Max is a highly trained, disciplined companion, usually calm and incredibly methodical when we explore these forgotten places. But right now, he was possessed by something primal. He was hurling his massive frame against a seemingly solid, moss-covered brick wall tucked away in the darkest, most claustrophobic corner of the cellar. His thick claws were tearing desperately at the decaying mortar, emitting a horrible, grating, scratching sound that sent deep shivers down my tall spine. I rushed over, dropping my heavy canvas equipment backpack onto the dirt floor with a dull thud, and lunged forward to grab the heavy nylon handle of his tactical harness. I planted my boots and pulled with all my strength. "Easy, buddy. You're going to tear your paws apart. It's just a dead-end wall," I grunted. Struggling against his immense, unyielding, pulling force, he was trembling. Every muscle in his body coiled tight like a spring, instead of backing down. Max planted his hind legs firmly into the loose, damp earth, lowered his head and let out a low, terrifying, rumbling growl directed straight at the solid brickwork. It was the kind of growl he usually reserved for imminent danger. He snapped his powerful jaws at the wall, then aggressively dug his wet snout into a small, deteriorating spiderweb-covered crack between two massive crumbling red bricks, and then, as I knelt beside him, still gripping his harness, I felt it. I froze, completely paralyzed by a physical sensation that utterly defied all logic and reason. We were in the middle of a sweltering, unforgiving mid-July heat wave in rural Ohio. The air inside this dilapidated basement was a stifling, humid oven that made it difficult to draw a full breath. Yet as my face hovered mere inches from the weathered bricks, a sudden, violent, and continuous blast of freezing air hit my sweat-drenched skin. It was pouring directly out of the hairline crack in the decaying mortar. It didn't just feel cold. It felt entirely unnatural. It carried with it a heavy, sickening, and distinct scent. It wasn't just the smell of old dirt. It was the odor of ancient ash, stale dampness, and something else. Something that triggered a deeply ingrained human instinct. It smelled like confined terror. It smelled like a space that had been sealed off in a moment of sheer desperation. "What in the world?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The beam of my flashlight trembled in my hand. My warm breath visibly turned into a faint white mist as it met the freezing draft. The wall wasn't solid. The farmhouse wasn't just resting on a foundation. It was breathing. Before my mind could even process the necessity of reaching into my bag for a masonry chisel, Max acted. He let out a sharp, urgent yelp, lunged forward with blinding speed, and clamped his strong jaws onto a loose piece of rusted iron, jutting out awkwardly from the weakened mortar line. He planted his back legs, the muscles in his thick neck bulging, and violently yanked his head back, with a sickening, hollow crunch that seemed to echo through time itself. A massive chunk of the brick wall simply gave way. It collapsed inward, not outward, sending a thick, choking cloud of blinding white dust and pulverized mortar into the dead air. I coughed violently, raising my arm to shield my eyes, waving my free hand to clear the suffocating debris. I quickly aimed the concentrated center of my flashlight beam into the jagged, black void Max had just violently ripped open. The light didn't hit packed soil. It didn't hit a foundation. It stretched endlessly forward, swallowed by a pitch-black hidden cavern that was never ever supposed to be there. But it wasn't the hidden tunnel that made the blood drain from my face. It was what Max had pulled out of the wall that made my heart completely stop. He turned to me and gently dropped the heavy, dirt-caked object into the loose soil right at the toe of my boots. It hit the ground with a dull, heavy, unmistakable metallic clank. My hands were physically shaking as I reached down into the dirt, slowly brushing the centuries-old, damp earth. away from the heavily rusted iron. At first glance, it was just a chain, but as I pulled it fully into the harsh glare of my flashlight, the true horrifying reality of the object revealed itself. It wasn't just a simple chain. It was a heavy hand-forged iron shackle, and it was tiny. It was unmistakably, undeniably crafted for the slender ankle of a young child. I knelt there in the dirt, staring intensely at the rusted broken metal resting heavily in my palm. The freezing, ghostly air from the hidden tunnel washed continuously over my trained shoulders, carrying with it the silent echoes of the 1850s. I looked up at Max. He was no longer frantic. He was sitting perfectly still, silent now, staring deeply and mournfully into the black abyss he had just exposed. "My God, Max," I managed to choke out, my voice breaking in the suffocating silence of the cellar. "Whoever was hiding behind this wall. They've been waiting for someone to find them for over 170 years. I wiped the sweat from my forehead with the back of my dust-covered glove. My eyes completely locked on the rusted ring of iron sitting heavily in my palm. The beam of my flashlight trembled, casting long, distorted, dancing shadows against the damp dirt walls of the cellar. This wasn't just a random piece of farm equipment or discarded scrap metal forgotten by time. It was heavy, hand-forged by a blacksmith, bearing the unmistakable crude curvature designed specifically to clasp around a human ankle, a child's ankle. But as I ran my thumb over the heavily pitted surface of the iron, brushing away decades of accumulated damp grime, a specific detail sent a profound, freezing chill through my veins that had absolutely nothing to do with the unnatural draft pouring from the cracked wall. The locking mechanism wasn't rusted shut. It hadn't naturally worn away over a century of neglect. It had been violently shattered. Deep, jagged strike marks scored the iron, clearly indicating that someone had taken a heavy steel chisel and a sledgehammer to it, forcefully breaking the lock from the outside. To truly understand the immense gravity of what Max had just unearthed, you have to understand the ghosts that haunt the soil we were standing on. This wasn't just an abandoned farmhouse. It was a property sitting in the deep rural heart of southern Ohio. Back in the 1850s, this very land was ground zero for one of the most dangerous, desperate and secretive resistance movements in American history. Just a few dozen miles south of here lay the churning waters of the Ohio River, the treacherous natural border that legally separated the slave-holding states of the South from the fragile promise of freedom in the North. Following the passage of the brutal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, simply crossing that river was no longer enough to guarantee safety. Ruthless bounty hunters and federally deputized slave catchers roamed these exact woods, legally empowered to drag escaped men, women, and children back into unimaginable chains. Anyone caught aiding a runaway faced catastrophic fines, brutal imprisonment, and violent retribution from angry mobs. Yet, despite the terrifying risks, everyday people, farmers, merchants, preachers quietly transformed their cellars, barns, and attics into hidden, subterranean sanctuaries. They were the silent conductors of the Underground Railroad. Standing here in the freezing dark, staring at this violently broken shackle, the pieces suddenly fell into place. This wasn't a place of captivity. It was a station of liberation. I carefully placed the broken shackle into the padded side pocket of my canvas tactical bag, treating the rusted metal with the profound reverence of a sacred religious relic. I looked down at Max. My German shepherd hadn't moved a single muscle. His glowing amber eyes were still fixed entirely on the jagged, breathing black hole he had torn into the masonry. "All right, buddy," I whispered, the sound of my own voice feeling fragile in the heavy silence. I reached into my bag and pulled out my heavy steel masonry hammer. Let's see what they left behind. The sharp, ringing sound of steel striking century-old brick was absolutely deafening in the confined space of the cellar. Every heavy swing sent a jarring shock up my forearm. Dust rained down in thick, choking sheets, coating my hair, filling my lungs, and sticking to the sweat on my neck. I worked meticulously but urgently, clearing away the weakened, crumbling mortar and pulling out the heavy, blood-red bricks one by one. I kept going until the jagged hole was just wide enough for a man's shoulders to painfully squeeze through. As the opening grew, the blast of freezing, Stagnant air became overwhelmingly strong, carrying the distinct, earthy aroma of a space that had been completely sealed off from the living world before the American Civil War had even begun. I clicked my primary tactical flashlight to its highest, blinding lumen setting, took a deep, steadying breath of the dusty air, and forced my head and shoulders through the jagged brick opening. The rough, broken edges of the masonry scraped aggressively against my heavy canvas jacket, catching and tearing the fabric as I shimmied my way deeper into the unknown. As soon as my heavy boots hit the unseen ground on the other side, the temperature plummeted drastically. It was like stepping from a sweltering, humid jungle directly into an industrial meat locker. The oppressive heat of the July afternoon instantly vanished, replaced by a bone-chilling, subterranean dampness that immediately raised the hair on my arms and made my breath plume in front of my face. I stepped aside, and a second later, Max scrambled silently through the narrow hole, his thick black and tan fur brushing against the cold stone. He didn't bark. He didn't rush forward with his usual boundless energy. He immediately adopted a low, stalking posture, his nose hovering just a fraction of an inch above the densely packed dirt floor. He was in full tracking mode, reading an invisible, ancient map of lingering scents and historical echoes that my human senses could never possibly comprehend. I slowly raised the flashlight, sweeping the beam deliberately from left to right. We weren't in another basement room. We were standing at the beginning of a narrow, hand-dug subterranean tunnel. The walls were rough, carved directly out of the dense, unforgiving Ohio clay, supported at irregular, precarious intervals by heavy, decaying oak timbers that looked remarkably like the rotting ribcage of a massive, forgotten beast. Thick, pale roots from the ancient oak trees above ground had violently broken through the dirt ceiling, hanging down like skeletal, grasping fingers in the pale, artificial light of my torch. The ceiling was terrifyingly low. I had to bend uncomfortably at the waist just to avoid grazing my hard hat against the splintering, damp wood. The silence inside this tunnel was absolute, heavy, and intensely suffocating. The familiar sounds of the summer cicadas and the wind outside were completely gone. Buried under tons of heavy earth and stone, the only sounds left in the entire world were the harsh, ragged rasp of my own breathing, the soft, rhythmic crunch of our boots and paws on the dirt, and the intense, rapid sniffing of my dog. Max took a tentative, calculated step forward, his ears swiveling like radar dishes, pulling us deeper into the claustrophobic darkness. We were walking in the literal, hidden footsteps of those who had fled through the darkest nights of American history, praying desperately that they would live long enough to see the dawn. The deeper we pushed into the subterranean artery, the more the earth seemed to actively resist our intrusion. The ceiling, held up by those rotting, splintered oak beams, steadily dropped lower and lower until I was practically forced onto my hands and knees, dragging my heavy tactical bag behind me through the damp, unforgiving Ohio clay. Every time my shoulder brushed against the narrow, claustrophobic walls, a fresh shower of loose dirt and pulverized rock rained down onto the back of my neck. The air grew perceptibly thinner, incredibly heavy with the suffocating scent of age, undisturbed decay, and an overwhelming sense of isolation. It felt less like an escape route and more like a subterranean tomb that was slowly, inevitably shrinking around us. I kept my flashlight angled forward, the bright beam struggling to cut through the swirling, dusty haze we were kicking up. Max was just a few feet ahead of me, his body low to the ground, his nose working frantically to follow an invisible trail of history. But suddenly, the tunnel just stopped. My beam hit a solid, impenetrable wall of collapsed earth and violently tangled. Massive tree roots, a catastrophic cave-in from decades, maybe over a century ago, had completely choked the passage. Tons of heavy soil blocked our path. There was no way through. It was a complete and utter dead end. "It's over, buddy," I whispered, the crushing weight of disappointment and exhaustion settling heavily in my chest. I wiped a thick layer of grime from my face. The earth took it back. There's nowhere else to go. We have to turn around, as if responding to the sheer hopelessness in my voice. My primary tactical flashlight, a heavy-duty piece of equipment that had never failed me in years of exploration, suddenly flickered violently. I tapped the heavy aluminum casing aggressively against my gloved palm. The bright beam strobed uncontrollably, casting horrific, jagged, dancing shadows across the collapsed wall of mud, before dying completely with a pathetic electric click. The darkness that instantly swallowed us wasn't just an absence of light. It was a physical, crushing weight. It was the absolute blinding blackness of being buried alive. Panic, sharp and primal, immediately clawed at my throat. I couldn't see my own hand inches from my face. The sheer tonnage of the earth above us suddenly felt terrifyingly present, pressing down hard on my chest, threatening to suffocate me in the pitch-black silence. I scrambled frantically for the small backup penlight in my chest pocket, my heavy fingers feeling clumsy and numb in the terrifying void. "Max," I rasped, my voice betraying a raw edge of genuine panic. "Come here, we need to leave now." But Max didn't return to my side, instead out of the suffocating, pitch-black silence. I heard a sound that chilled me to the absolute bone. It was the frantic, aggressive sound of heavy claws tearing violently into the packed earth. "Scrape, scrape, scrape. Max, stop!" I yelled, my heart hammering violently against my ribs as I finally managed to pull the small backup light from my pocket and desperately clicked it on. The weak, concentrated beam sliced through the darkness. Max wasn't digging at the collapsed wall of dirt ahead of us. He was furiously excavating the very floor we were standing on. Right in the dead center of the tunnel, dirt was flying everywhere in a chaotic arc, kicking up violently into the stale air. I crawled toward him on my knees to pull him away before he disturbed a foundational support and brought the unstable ceiling down on both of our heads. But before my hand could even reach his harness, his thick claws struck something that made my heart completely stop. Thud. It wasn't the dull, familiar scrape of stone or the soft yielding of wet clay. It was a deep, hollow, resonant impact. It was the unmistakable sound of solid wood covering empty space. I froze entirely, the penlight shaking wildly in my grip. I shoved my heavy gloves off, dropping my bare hands into the cold, loose dirt he had just aggressively disturbed. I dug like a madman alongside my dog, my fingernails scraping against something solid, flat, and remarkably preserved. I violently brushed away decades of tightly packed earth until the weak beam of my light revealed the unmistakable parallel grain of heavy, rough-hewn oak planks, and right in the dead center, perfectly flush with the rotting wood, was a heavily oxidized hand-forged iron pull ring. Max stopped digging, letting out a sharp, expectant huff, his tail giving a single hard wag against the dirt wall. He hadn't brought me to a dead end. He had brought me to a cleverly disguised threshold. My hands were shaking violently as I gripped the freezing iron ring. It wouldn't budge at first. It had been sealed tightly by the immense weight of time, moisture, and earth for over 170 years. I braced my heavy boots firmly against the dirt floor, let out a strained, agonizing yell that echoed deeply into the dead earth, and pulled upward with every single ounce of strength I had left in my trembling body. With a deafening, agonizing groan of rusted iron and violently protesting wood, the ancient seal finally broke, a sudden gust of incredibly stale, freezing air rushed upward into my face, blowing out the last of the loose dirt. I leaned over the dark threshold, aiming my trembling flashlight down into the newly opened void. My breath caught sharply in my throat, completely paralyzing me in a state of pure awe. This wasn't just a hidden hatch or a storage bin. The beam illuminated the top rungs of a crude, hand-tied wooden ladder, leading straight down into a second, significantly larger subterranean chamber, a masterfully hidden sanctuary buried entirely beneath the decoy tunnel. When my flashlight swept across the final room below, I stopped breathing. The goosebumps erupted aggressively across my arms and the back of my neck. We hadn't just found a hidden room. We had just breached a perfectly preserved time capsule of human survival. The rough, hand-tied rungs of the wooden ladder groaned in agonizing protest beneath the heavy soles of my boots, the ancient oak complaining but miraculously holding firm against the weight of the modern world. I descended slowly, deliberately, swallowed completely by the earth. My flashlight beam cut through the dense, swirling dust like a solid blade of cold white light, revealing the floor of a second, significantly deeper subterranean chamber. As my boots finally touched the soft, dry clay of the bottom, Max didn't hesitate. With surprising grace for a dog his size, He carefully navigated the shallow drop, landing softly beside me. The frantic energy that had possessed him upstairs was entirely gone. He didn't pace, and he didn't growl. Instead, he simply lowered his head, took a long, deep breath of the incredibly stale air, and let out a soft, almost mournful sigh. I raised my flashlight, my hand trembling slightly, and began to sweep the beam across the hidden sanctuary. When the light illuminated the full scope of the room, the breath physically caught in my throat, and a profound involuntary shiver cascaded down my spine. This wasn't a tomb, and it certainly wasn't a dungeon. It was a fiercely guarded harbor of humanity in a sea of historical cruelty. The room was agonizingly small, perhaps no more than 8 feet across. But it had been arranged with meticulous, heartbreaking care. In the far corner lay a makeshift bed of rotting straw, covered by the decaying, fragile remnants of a hand-stitched patchwork quilt. Time and moisture had reduced the fabric to gray, ghostly rags. But the intricate pattern of the stitches remained visible, a silent testament to someone upstairs who had spent their evenings crafting warmth for strangers they were forbidden by law to help. Resting on a small, overturned wooden crate that served as a crude table was a severely dented tin cup, a hollowed-out gourd used as a water dipper, and a small, rusted iron candlestick holding a puddle of hardened tallow that had burned out over a century and a half ago. The silence down here was absolute, pressing against my eardrums with a physical weight. But it was no longer terrifying. It felt incredibly sacred, like standing in the center of an empty cathedral, long after the congregation had gone. Max took a few quiet steps forward, his paws making no sound on the packed dirt, and gently sniffed the edge of the decaying quilt. He circled once, circled twice, and deliberately laid his heavy body down, right beside the makeshift bed. He rested his chin on his front paws, his amber eyes looking up at me with an expression of profound, completely uncharacteristic stillness. He had found what he was looking for, and he knew they were safe. I moved closer to the opposite wall, the beam of my light catching a strange, irregular texture on the flat clay surface. I stepped within inches of the dirt wall and stopped breathing entirely. There, etched deeply into the dried earth with thick, bold strokes of black charcoal, was a mural. It was primitive, clearly drawn by the unsteady hand of a child. But the emotion it conveyed was overwhelmingly powerful. There was a drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands, a family. Above them, an enormous, exaggerated sun with long, radiating beams dominated the ceiling of the earthen canvas. It was a desperate, beautiful projection of hope drawn by someone who was currently living in absolute darkness, terrified of the men with dogs and guns roaming the woods directly above their head. My eyes followed the charcoal strokes downward to a small niche carefully carved out of the dirt wall. Resting inside the alcove was a tiny leather-bound pocket Bible. The leather was stiff and heavily water-stained, its pages warped by decades of subterranean humidity. I slowly took off my heavy work gloves, my fingers trembling as I reached out to touch the artifact. I gently opened the fragile cover, terrified it would crumble to dust in my hands. Tucked safely just inside, the front cover was a small, torn scrap of coarse parchment. The ink had long faded, but the heavy charcoal writing pressed into the paper was still unmistakably legible. I leaned in, bringing the flashlight closer, and read the unevenly scrawled words aloud, my voice cracking and echoing in the tiny buried room. Elijah, 8 years old, free at last winter, 1856. May God bless this house. The words hit my chest like a physical blow. The sudden, overwhelming realization of what I was looking at brought hot, stinging tears instantly to my eyes. I reached down to the padded pocket of my tactical bag and pulled out the heavy, violently shattered iron shackle that Max had ripped from the brick wall upstairs just an hour ago. I looked at the tiny circumference of the rusted iron. I looked at the jagged, shattered locking mechanism that had been destroyed by heavy, deliberate strikes from a blacksmith's hammer. And then I looked back at the charcoal drawing of the sun. The horrifying narrative I had constructed in my head completely unraveled, replaced by a truth so profoundly moving, it forced me to my knees in the dirt. That child-sized shackle wasn't a symbol of captivity at this farmhouse. It was the exact opposite. Little 8-year-old Elijah had arrived at this property in the dead of winter, Terrified, freezing, and bound in heavy iron, the brave homeowner, the station master of this underground railroad stop, hadn't just hidden the boy. They had taken a chisel and a sledgehammer and violently shattered the chains of his enslavement. They had physically broken his bondage. And then, instead of throwing the broken iron away, they had deliberately sealed it behind the thick mortar and brick of the basement wall upstairs. They buried the shackle so that Elijah's past would be permanently entombed, leaving the boy to wait in the warm safety of this hidden room below until it was safe to make the final, perilous journey north to Canada. I knelt there in the freezing dirt of the 1850s, holding the shattered chains of a freed child in one hand and staring at his drawing of the sun. For over 170 years, little Elijah's story, his terror, and his ultimate liberation had been silenced, buried under tons of forgotten Ohio clay. But today, because a German shepherd refused to walk away from a cracked brick wall, his voice was finally echoing in the light once again. I remained on my knees in the freezing, stagnant air of that subterranean sanctuary for a long time, the heavy, shattered iron shackle resting in one hand, my flashlight illuminating the fragile, charcoal drawing of the sun in the other. The overwhelming silence of the hidden room was no longer oppressive. It felt intensely sacred, like standing in the quiet nave of an empty cathedral. I could almost hear the phantom echoes of an 8-year-old boy, terrified but finally safe, taking his first deep breath of freedom while the dangerous world hunted him just a few feet above. With a trembling hand, I carefully placed the small water-stained pocket Bible back into the earthen niche, exactly where the brave station master had left it over 170 years ago. Then, with profound reverence, I laid the violently broken iron shackle right beside it. I didn't bring my heavy tactical bag down here to collect souvenirs. I am an explorer, not a grave robber. This tiny hand-dug room wasn't an archaeological dig site to be meticulously catalogued and stripped bare for a museum display. It was a deeply personal tomb of memory. The broken chains belonged to the earth of this farmhouse. They belonged to the legacy of the courageous family who risked the gallows to shatter them. And most importantly, they belonged to little Elijah. We were merely temporary visitors, entirely unworthy of disturbing the profound peace they had fought so desperately to secure. Max let out a soft, low whine, pulling me back from the heavy grasp of the 1850s. He stepped closer, gently nudging my dusty forearm with his cold, wet nose. The frantic primal energy that had driven him to tear through solid brick was completely gone, replaced by a calm, gentle exhaustion. I reached out, burying my hand into the thick fur of his neck, pulling him close. "You did good, buddy," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Echoing softly against the clay walls, "You found him. You made sure they weren't forgotten." I took one final sweeping look at the small room, burning the image of the charcoal family into my memory before turning off my primary flashlight to conserve battery, using the weak beam of my backup penlight. I grasped the rotting oak rungs of the ladder and began the agonizing climb back up to the decoy tunnel. Max followed effortlessly, scrambling up the earth incline with practiced agility. Once we were both standing safely back in the upper dirt passage, I grabbed the heavy, oxidized iron pull ring of the wooden trapdoor with a slow, deliberate heave. I lowered the thick oak planks back into place. The heavy thud of the wood ceiling flush against the earthen floor resonated through my boots with a profound sense of finality. I used my boots to gently kick the loose, dry clay back over the trapdoor, completely burying the iron ring. Once again, the sanctuary was safe. It would remain a ghost, hidden from a world that had moved on. We slowly navigated our way back through the suffocating, narrow tunnel, squeezing through the jagged, broken hole Max had torn in the brick wall. As we climbed the rotting wooden stairs of the cellar, the freezing, unnatural draft of the underground faded entirely, replaced by the sweltering, heavy humidity of the modern Ohio afternoon. I pushed my shoulder against the dilapidated wooden basement door, forcing it open against a wall of overgrown weeds. The immediate transition was blinding. The harsh, golden light of the setting July sun poured aggressively over us, forcing me to shield my eyes with a dirt-caked hand. I took a massive, greedy breath of the fresh, warm air, the scent of wild grass and pine needles filling my lungs, washing away the smell of century-old dust and confined terror. I looked down at Max. He was standing tall in the tall grass, his golden coat catching the brilliant light of the sunset. His ears perked forward as he watched the tree line. I looked up at the massive fiery sun dipping below the Ohio horizon, and I instantly thought of the crude, exaggerated charcoal sun drawn on the wall of a lightless tomb deep beneath my feet. Elijah had drawn a sun he couldn't see, holding on to a hope he had barely tasted, and here we were, standing in the very light he had dreamed of. History isn't just a collection of dates, battles, and forgotten names printed in thick, dusty textbooks, I said to the camera in a steady, reflective voiceover. Watching the shadows of the trees stretch across the abandoned property, it isn't dead, it is incredibly alive, and it is painfully human. As a child, broken shackle, hidden deliberately behind a farmhouse wall, marking the exact miraculous moment a life of unimaginable terror turned into a life of boundless freedom. Time, nature, and neglect can bury almost anything, but truth has a remarkable way of waiting patiently beneath our boots. History never truly disappears. It only waits for someone brave enough or a dog stubborn enough to uncover it. I adjusted the heavy straps of my canvas backpack, looking directly into the lens. "What do you think about the incredible secret Max sniffed out today?" I asked, my tone sincere and grounded. "Can you even begin to imagine what it took for an 8-year-old boy to survive that journey? Please, leave your thoughts, your respects, and your feelings for little Elijah down in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And if you believe that these forgotten stories deserve to be brought back into the light, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and join Max and me next time, because there is always another mystery waiting in the dark."